Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a fascinating stack of research today, a body of work that, well, it really challenges some deeply held assumptions about homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
When we picture homelessness, a certain image often comes to mind, doesn't it? But the sources we've received paint a significantly different, perhaps even a surprising picture of who is being affected and why.
That's right. This research takes a deep dive into a reality that's often hidden from view: middle-class homelessness. It's compiled from data spanning 2024-2025, includes detailed policy analysis, and incorporates findings from a collaborative research effort focused specifically on this phenomenon.
Okay, and so our mission for this deep dive is to go through this specific research package you've provided. We want to understand, purely based on these sources, who this research says is being affected,
Right.
the surprising reasons behind it, and what the implications are for how we think about and, address homelessness. It's about cutting through assumptions and extracting the most important insights presented in this particular body of information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll be going through the key findings laid out in this research, really exploring each section to understand the full scope of the picture it paints. It's quite revealing.
Okay, let's unpack this. So where do we start?
Well, the research kicks off by immediately presenting a, let's say, striking statistic that really grabs your attention.
Okay.
It states that somewhere between 15% and 25% of individuals who became homeless recently, specifically, those experiencing homelessness for the first time, had middle-class incomes prior to losing their housing.
Just hold on there for a second. 15 to 25% of newly homeless individuals had middle-class incomes.
That's what the research indicates, yes.
Wow. That number alone forces you to rethink things immediately. It tells us this isn't solely a crisis confined to the very poorest or those, perpetually struggling below the poverty line.
Absolutely.
It fundamentally challenges the common stereotype that you have to be chronically poor to become homeless.
Absolutely it does. And the research is quite precise about what it means by middle class in this context. It defines this group based on households earning between 80% and 120% of the area median income.
Right. And what does that mean in, dollar terms?
Well, to make that concrete, the sources note that in most regions across the U.S., this typically translates to an annual income ranging from $60,000 to $100,000.
Okay, $60K to $100K. So we are definitely talking about people who are earning a solid wage, not minimum wage, not significantly below the poverty line. This is an income bracket that, a substantial portion of the population identifies with.
A very significant bracket, yes.
Right. So when the sources talk about these individuals having prior economic stability, what exactly did that look like according to this research? It wasn't a situation where they were always just scraping by, was it?
No, that's a critical distinction the research emphasizes. Their prior economic stability meant things like consistent recent employment.
Okay.
They often had savings built up, maybe even some investments or other assets. Some were homeowners, which is a significant marker of stability, and some had begun accumulating retirement accounts.
Right.
The picture painted by the sources is one of people who were integrated into the economy, who had achieved a level of financial security that most people associate with being firmly out of the realm of homelessness risk.
Okay, so they had income in a decent range, assets, possibly owned their home, yet they still became homeless. The research points to something it identifies as a key difference between this group and others experiencing homelessness. What's that about?
Yes, and this is a really insightful point derived from the source material. It highlights the key difference as their lack of poverty adaptation skills, contrasting them with those the research describes as the always poor.
Lack of poverty adaptation skills, that phrase is quite striking. What does the research mean by that in practical terms? What skills are they referring to?
Well, based on the sources, it means they haven't developed the specific survival strategies and coping mechanisms that individuals or families who have experienced persistent poverty often rely on. The research notes that people who have been always poor might have learned to leverage informal support networks extensively. For example, the research mentions that about a third used doubling up.
Right, staying with family or friends?
Exactly. Staying with family or friends is a common strategy when facing housing instability. They utilize deep-rooted community ties, have developed extreme cost-cutting methods, and are adept at resource sharing. This constant navigation of scarcity builds a kind of resilience and a very specific set of survival skills over time.
Right.
The middle class, having not faced these circumstances routinely, generally hasn't needed to develop or practice these particular strategies when a sudden crisis hits.
That's a really profound point. It's not just about the income disappearing, it's about the absence of a different kind of safety net, an informal, often community or family-based one, and the specific practical skills needed to navigate extreme financial precarity day to day.
Precisely.
The research also describes this group as a hidden population. Why does the source say they are frequently missed in official counts?
The research largely attributes this to the powerful force of stigma.
Ah, okay.
Individuals who were previously middle class often experience a heightened sense of shame, embarrassment, or, personal failure associated with losing their housing and becoming homeless.
Yeah, I can imagine.
This deep-seated reluctance to disclose their situation, combined with lack of familiarity or trust in formal help systems like shelters, means they often avoid traditional channels.
Right.
As a result, they are frequently missed in official point-in-time counts. Those annual snapshots that primarily count people in shelters or visibly on the streets.
So those they don't really capture everyone.
The source implies they simply don't capture the full scope of housing instability when people are trying to stay hidden.
Got it. And what are the other specific characteristics of this hidden middle-class population that the research details? You mentioned they connect back to that lack of poverty adaptation skills.
Right. The research points to several reinforcing characteristics. They tend to have higher fixed expenses that they maintained while they had income. Things like car payments, insurance premiums, sometimes student loan debt, or even mortgage payments.
Okay. The usual middle-class costs.
Yeah, exactly. When income stops, these fixed costs continue to drain remaining resources quickly. They often have more limited, informal support networks compared to those who have navigated poverty long-term.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, perhaps because their social ties were more based on shared economic status or formal relationships, rather than deep reliance during hardship.
I see.
Crucially, their asset savings, investments, even equity in a home, which were their primary buffer, deplete much faster when income disappears, precisely because they lack those alternative low-resource survival methods.
Right.
There isn't a pre-existing system of doubling up or community resource sharing to fall back on immediately. As we touched on, there's a strong reluctance to seek help from traditional homelessness services due to stigma and unfamiliarity.
So the fall is faster, maybe.
Yeah, it seems so. When a shock hits, their first and often only defense is their accumulated assets, and when those are gone, the fall into literal or hidden homelessness can be very swift without the established alternative strategies to slow it down.
Thinking about that picture painted by the sources that someone with a solid income, perhaps assets, facing a crisis without the informal networks or specific survival skills of navigating extreme poverty, and then hiding their situation due to stigma. What stands out to you most from this initial definition of middle-class homelessness? It's a completely different profile than what many people might typically imagine.
What was fascinating here is how fragile economic stability appears to be for anyone when faced with certain catastrophic events, even those who seemed well-cushioned.
Yeah.
It underscores that homelessness isn't solely an issue of chronic, lifelong deprivation. It's also profoundly about vulnerability to specific life events, like health crises or job loss, coupled with what the sources call a lack of certain resilience-building experiences and the specific kinds of safety nets that exist outside of formal financial institutions and income.
That makes perfect sense. It suggests that doing everything right by traditional measures, getting a good job, saving money, maybe buying a house, doesn't make you immune if a big enough shock hits and you don't have those alternative systems to fall back on.
Exactly.
Let's transition now to the scale of the problem and some of the statistical breakdowns the research provides. How big is this part of the iceberg?
Okay. If we zoom out to the bigger picture, the overall scale of homelessness is significant and, well, it's growing. The sources note that over 970,000 individuals experience homelessness for the very first time in 2023 alone.
Wow, almost 1 million people.
Yeah. This was, according to the research, a record high number of first-time homeless individuals recorded in a single year.
Nearly 1 million people becoming homeless for the first time in 1 year. That number is hard to even grasp. Now, the research provides a statistical breakdown table that helps position that initial 15-25% middle-class figure within different groups of the homeless population. It estimates the percentage within various categories who had prior middle-class or higher status. Can you walk us through that?
Yes, the table breaks down the percentages based on this research. For the first time homeless in 2023, The estimate with prior middle class or higher status is at 15% to 25%.
Okay, the number we started with.
Right. Among older adults, defined as those aged 55 and over, that percentage is notably higher, estimated at 30% to 35%.
30 to 35% for older adults, that's significant.
Very. For families with children experiencing homelessness, the estimate for prior middle-class status is 10% to 15%. And within the large group experiencing hidden homelessness that we just discussed, the estimate with prior middle-class status is also 10 to 15%.
So looking at those percentages across these different subgroups, what does that pattern imply about middle-class homelessness? It's not just one group.
No, what's fascinating here is that it demonstrates this isn't just a niche issue affecting only one narrow demographic. It indicates that individuals with prior middle-class status are represented across various segments of the homeless population,
Right.
including families and those experiencing hidden homelessness. The particularly high percentage among older adults is significant. It suggests that whatever triggers are pushing people into homelessness from stability are disproportionately impacting this age group.
Implying specific vulnerabilities for older people, even with income.
It implies specific vulnerabilities associated with being older, even with prior income, yeah.
The source describes 2024 as a record-breaking year, specifically in terms of this total count increase. How does this overall surge relate to the research's focus on the middle class?
Well, it underscores that the problem of homelessness is not static. It's rapidly escalating. While this 18% increase encompasses all demographics, the research context implies that the underlying pressures, the rising costs, the economic fragility we've discussed are intensifying across the board.
Making everyone more vulnerable.
Pretty much. This mounting pressure is likely pushing even more individuals and families who previously had some stability closer to the brink, increasing the pool from which middle-class homelessness draws. A rising tide might lift all boats, but maybe a collapsing floor drops everyone closer to it, including those who started higher up.
That makes sense. The system is under increasing strain, and the shocks are getting harder, making vulnerability wider spread. Let's shift focus now to the specific pathways detailed in the research. This is where it gets really interesting. How exactly does someone with prior stability and income lose their housing and end up in this situation? The research highlights some very specific key triggers.
Right. The sources dedicate a significant section to the connection between healthcare costs and homelessness, titled When Healthcare Becomes Homelessness.
Okay.
They detail the severe medical debt crisis and its direct link to housing loss. According to the research, a staggering 66% of all personal bankruptcies are tied, at least in part, to medical debt.
2/3, 66% of bankruptcies. That's an absolutely massive proportion. It means medical issues are the primary driver for most people filing for bankruptcy.
It is, and the sources take it a critical step further, stating that of those medical bankruptcies, a devastating 50% lead directly to housing loss.
Half of them.
Half. This statistic from the research is crucial because it makes the link explicit. Medical debt isn't just a financial hardship, it's a direct, proven pathway to losing your home.
And for the middle-class group specifically, the research includes a truly shocking figure related to medical costs and older adults.
Yes, it states that middle-class seniors, a group we saw was disproportionately affected, spend over $250,000 on medical costs, specifically before becoming homeless.
$250,000.
Yeah, this isn't the total cost of their health care over many years. This is money they had access to or spent to address health issues in the period preceding their housing loss.
$250,000 plus for seniors spent before they become homeless. That number is immense. And the sources make a point that this isn't limited to the uninsured.
No, definitely not.
Even families with health insurance face devastating out-of-pocket expenses, deductibles, copays, treatments not fully covered.
Right.
This really hammers home that healthcare costs, even for those with resources or insurance they believed would protect them, can completely overwhelm financial stability. It shows healthcare costs are a major direct trigger pushing this group into homelessness.
What's fascinating here is the way the research clearly identifies and quantifies this pathway. It demonstrates that even a significant income and some assets are insufficient buffers against the runaway costs of healthcare in certain circumstances, leading directly to asset depletion and eventually housing loss.
Okay, so medical debt is presented as one major trigger. The other significant one detailed in the research is when rent outpaces income. The sources explicitly lay out the math of this problem with several data points.
Yes, they provide compelling statistics to illustrate the housing affordability crisis as a direct driver. They point out that in places like New York City, 40% of individuals residing in homeless shelters were actually employed, but simply couldn't afford market rate rent in the city.
Employed with a job, but still ending up in a shelter because rent is too high. That, again, powerfully contradicts the idea that joblessness is the sole or even primary cause of homelessness.
Exactly. The research also states that 20% of middle-class earners, that $60,000 to $100,000 income bracket we defined earlier, are spending more than 50% of their income on housing.
50%.
The term used is severely rent-burdened.
Spending over half your income just for a place to live. That leaves incredibly little money for anything else. Food, transportation, healthcare, clothing, and absolutely no buffer for unexpected events like a medical bill, a car repair, or even a temporary job loss.
Precisely. The sources also provide broader context about the housing supply crunch, noting that there are only 37 affordable homes available for every 100 extremely low-income renters.
Wow.
While this statistic focuses on the lowest income bracket, it highlights the overall severe shortage in the affordable housing market that creates upward pressure on all rents.
Right. It affects everyone.
And critically, the research found that states experiencing the most significant spikes in rents saw corresponding homelessness spikes ranging from 39% to 52%.
Huge jumps. Connecting that rent crisis specifically to the middle class, as defined by this research, households earning $60,000 to $100,000. Even earning in that solid range isn't enough to absorb the cost of housing in many high-cost areas if you're already spending over half your income on rent.
Not even close in some places.
What does this suggest, based on the research, about the very definition of affordable housing, or even what constitutes a middle-class income in different parts of the country? It seems like the old definitions might be completely out of sync with reality.
This raises an important question, highlighted by the sources, about the geographical disparity in economic reality. An income that provides stability and security in one region might be fundamentally inadequate in another due to housing costs.
Yeah.
The research implies that in many high-cost urban and coastal areas, an income traditionally considered middle class simply isn't a sufficient shield against the risk of housing instability because the math of rent versus income just doesn't work, leaving individuals incredibly vulnerable to any additional financial shock.
So you have catastrophic medical crises eating through savings and assets, and soaring housing costs eating up income, leaving no financial buffer whatsoever. This brings us back to that crucial distinction the research made earlier between the always poor and the middle class, and the source's argument for why the middle class is sometimes more vulnerable to becoming literally homeless.
This section is quite insightful, titled, "Why the Always Poor Survive While Middle Class Falls," according to the source. It really expands on those differences in coping mechanisms we touched on earlier.
Okay.
The research lists the always poor strategies, things like relying heavily on doubling up with family or friends, utilizing strong, established informal support networks and community ties, employing extreme cost-cutting measures, and practicing resource sharing. These are described as skills honed over time through navigating persistent scarcity, building resilience.
And contrasting that sharply with the middle-class vulnerabilities listed in the source. The lack of those specific poverty adaptation skills, higher fixed expenses, and lifestyle costs that are hard to shed quickly.
Right. Much hard to adjust downwards rapidly.
Limited informal support networks accustomed to providing housing or significant financial aid. And critically, the observation that asset depletion happens much faster for this group than intervention can typically occur.
The analysis the research presents here is quite stark. It suggests that while the always poor endure chronic deprivation and face immense hardship constantly, their established coping mechanisms and their deep reliance on those informal, non-financial networks act as a crucial, albeit precarious, buffer against literal, visible homelessness.
Keeping them off the street, essentially, even if unstable.
Exactly. Finding ways to stay off the streets or out of formal shelters, even if their housing situation involves significant overcrowding or instability like couch surfing. The middle class, however, lacking these specific learned strategies and networks, tends to rely primarily on their accumulated financial assets as their first and often only defense against a shock.
Okay.
When a major event like job loss or a medical crisis hits, they burn through savings, investments, or home equity rapidly. The research indicates that once those assets are exhausted, they often lack the alternative, non-financial strategies or the informal networks necessary to prevent the final step into visible homelessness or prolonged hidden homelessness.
Because they never needed them before.
Because they haven't built those alternative systems over time, yeah.
So it's not arguing that the always poor have it easier or are not struggling immensely. They absolutely are, chronically. It's that the specific outcome of literal, visible homelessness might be buffered by a different set of survival skills and community ties that the middle class hasn't needed to develop because their safety net was previously financial and asset-based.
That seems to be the core argument presented in the source, yes.
What does this distinction, as presented in the research, imply about the very nature of safety nets and support systems in our society? It seems like those informal networks are a powerful form of prevention that isn't evenly distributed.
Well, this raises an important question highlighted by the sources about what constitutes a robust safety net. Formal systems like unemployment benefits or housing assistance are vital, clearly.
Of course.
But the research strongly suggests that informal, community, and family-based support systems play an equally, if not sometimes more immediate role in preventing the most severe outcome of housing loss. And these informal networks are not equally available or structured in the same way across different socioeconomic classes or demographic groups, leaving those who relied solely on formal and financial stability uniquely exposed when those systems fail or are depleted.
That is a critical point and makes you really think differently about the full picture of economic security. Let's revisit the concept of hidden homelessness that we touched on earlier, but explore it in more detail as presented in the research. This is the invisible crisis the sources describe.
Right. The sources provide some, frankly, eye-opening numbers on this broader phenomenon of housing instability that isn't immediately visible. They state that an estimated 24.5 million Americans experience what is often termed hidden homelessness.
24.5 million people.
Yeah. This category includes individuals who are couch surfing, temporarily doubling up with other households because they have nowhere else to go, or staying in other precarious situations not designed for permanent habitation, but who are not counted in official street or shelter counts.
That number is absolutely staggering. That's a vast number of people experiencing some form of housing instability that doesn't show up in the standard counts we usually hear about.
And crucially, the research estimates that 10% to 15% of this massive group, the hidden homeless, had middle-class incomes before they were displaced into this precarious hidden situation.
Okay, 10-15% of 24.5 million.
That translates to between 2.45 million and 3.68 million people.
So you're telling me that the estimated number of people experiencing hidden homelessness who used to be middle class is potentially larger than the total number of people counted as visibly homeless in 2024?
Exactly. That's a major point the research emphasizes. It highlights that HUD's official counting methodology, which primarily focuses on individuals in shelters or visibly unsheltered on the streets during a specific point in time, misses an estimated 80% of this hidden population.
80% missed. Wow.
The sources argue that this means official counts tend to heavily skew towards chronic poverty and visible street homelessness, failing to capture the vast number of individuals and families experiencing housing instability who are temporarily staying with friends or family, often precisely because they are trying to avoid entering the formal shelter system due to stigma or other factors.
This is where the research uses that analogy, which is incredibly apt, the iceberg effect. What we see is just the tip.
It's a perfect analogy. This hidden group represents the enormous unseen portion of housing instability beneath the surface of official statistics. They are experiencing very real, often severe housing insecurity.
Yeah.
But because they aren't in shelters or visibly on the streets, they are not counted in the official numbers and therefore often not accessing the services designed for visible homelessness.
And the significance of this, particularly the large middle-class segment within this hidden population, what does that tell us?
It strongly suggests that the true scale of housing instability, and specifically the scale of instability affecting people who previously had resources, is far, far greater than official numbers indicate.
Okay.
It highlights that the problem isn't just about those who have reached the absolute bottom and are visibly homeless. It includes millions more who are precariously housed, often hidden from view, many of whom came from more stable backgrounds and are desperately trying to avoid being counted in the system.
So our policies might be missing a huge part of the picture.
This critical gap in understanding means our policy responses and resource allocations are likely insufficient to address the full scope of the problem, according to the research.
That really does change the perspective on the size of the challenge. Let's look at the patterns identified in the research, where this is happening, and who is most affected within this broader picture, including the middle class segment. The sources look at age, location, family, and race.
Okay. On the age factor, the research confirms that adults aged 55 and over constitute the fastest-growing group experiencing homelessness overall.
We saw that high percentage earlier.
Yes, and significantly, it reiterates the statistic we saw earlier. 35% of this older adult homeless population had incomes over $50,000 annually before becoming homeless.
Right.
This connects directly back to the medical debt issue we discussed. Aging often brings increased health costs, which can rapidly deplete savings, even for those with decent earnings history or fixed incomes like retirement, making them uniquely vulnerable to housing loss.
So it's not just getting older, it's the confluence of age-related health vulnerability and the financial strain it puts on accumulated resources or fixed incomes that makes this group particularly susceptible, according to the research.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
The research also points out that location matters significantly.
Yes. The sources note that high-cost metropolitan areas like New York, California, and Oregon are where the highest rates of middle-class displacement into homelessness are observed.
And why is this particularly relevant for the middle class as defined by the research? Is it just the cost?
It's perhaps intuitive, but based on the source material, it's because in these areas, the already exorbitant costs of housing, combined with potentially high costs for other necessities, erode savings and assets much faster than in lower-cost areas.
Less cushion.
Exactly. An income of $60,000 or $100,000 simply doesn't provide the same financial cushion when faced with rents that consume 50% or more of that income. The buffer is smaller, and the cost of any financial misstep or crisis is much higher, leading to faster asset depletion and increased vulnerability to housing loss.
Makes sense. What about family impact?
The research also highlights the family impact. It states that children under 18 experienced a concerning 33% increase in homelessness between 2023 and 2024.
A third increase in 1 year. That's awful.
It is. This statistic underscores that when a household loses housing, it often involves entire families, including children. While the research doesn't specifically break down how many of these children were in formerly middle-class households in this particular point,
Right.
the earlier data about families with children having a 10–15% prior middle-class status means this surge almost certainly includes families from that background.
That statistic on children is incredibly poignant and shows the intergenerational impact of this crisis. Finally, the research notes overall racial disparities within the homeless population.
Yes.
While this section doesn't break down middle-class homelessness specifically by race, it states a finding from the sources. 32% of the overall homeless population is Black, compared to 12% of the general population.
Right. The sources include this statistic to provide a broader context on the disparities within the homelessness crisis as a whole. We are reporting what the sources present here, which is that while homelessness affects all groups, certain racial groups are disproportionately represented in the overall population experiencing homelessness.
Understood. It's important to report the findings as presented in the research. Now, thankfully, the research doesn't just detail the problem, it also spends time examining solutions and what works.
Yes, which is crucial.
It highlights a specific success story that, according to the sources, serves as compelling proof that investing in solutions yields results. The case of veterans experiencing homelessness.
This is presented as a key section titled Proof That Solutions Work, Veteran Success Story. The research details very positive findings regarding veteran homelessness over the past several years. It notes that veteran homelessness was reduced by 7.6% in 2024 alone.
A reduction.
Yes, a reduction, reaching the lowest recorded level since comprehensive tracking began.
That's a significant reduction, moving in the opposite direction of the overall trend. How did the sources say this was achieved? What was the key?
The research specifically points to the effectiveness of the HUD-VH program. This is a collaboration between the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Okay.
The sources state that this program has successfully housed nearly 90,000 veterans. And crucially, the research emphasizes that the success of HUD-VH was due to a combination of providing housing vouchers along with integrated support services tailored to veterans' needs.
Ah, so not just the housing.
Right. It wasn't just about the housing itself. It was the wraparound support that made the difference, according to the research.
So, based on the research, what is the absolute key takeaway from this veterans example? What's the lesson?
The sources are very clear and emphatic on this point. They state, model demonstrates effectiveness of comprehensive approach. And even more strongly, they title the section a success story and explicitly state, when we invest in solutions, they work.
Okay.
The core takeaway, according to the research, is that dedicated resources, strategically applied through a comprehensive model that combines housing assistance with necessary support services, can dramatically reduce homelessness for a specific vulnerable population.
That's powerful evidence that the problem is not intractable. Solutions exist, and when implemented comprehensively, they are effective. Building on that success story, the research lists several other evidence-based solutions that are supported by research findings.
Right, these are approaches that the research indicates have a proven track record of success. The sources list universal housing vouchers as a key solution, stating that research points to it as the most comprehensive solution for addressing homelessness broadly.
Universal vouchers, okay. What else?
They also highlight prevention programs, emphasizing the effectiveness of intervening early with things like rental assistance and financial counseling to stop homelessness before it starts.
Makes sense. Prevention is key.
Definitely. There's mention of targeted emergency housing vouchers, with 70,000 provided for specific vulnerable groups, and rapid rehousing, an approach that focuses on getting people into stable housing immediately and then providing time-limited support services to help them regain stability.
What do these specific solutions recommended by the research seem to have in common? It feels like they all involve not just addressing the immediate lack of housing, but also providing support to help maintain that housing.
Exactly. They largely mirror the core components of the successful veteran model, acknowledging that while getting someone into housing is the essential first step,
Right.
providing support for the issues that led to housing loss or that might jeopardize future stability is critical for long-term success. This reinforces the central lesson drawn from the veteran's story.
Another key theme woven throughout the research is the absolute importance of prevention. Stopping homelessness before it even starts is presented as a vital strategy. The sources list specific methods for stopping homelessness before it starts.
Yes, under that heading, the research details several specific prevention strategies. Medical debt relief is listed explicitly as a method to prevent healthcare-related housing loss,
Connecting back to that trigger.
directly linking back to one of the major triggers we identified. Eviction diversion programs are highlighted as crucial for keeping families housed during crises by addressing the issues that lead to eviction. Emergency rental assistance is noted as essential bridge funding to help individuals and families weather temporary financial setbacks. And disaster DV subsidies are listed as targeted support for people facing housing loss due to specific crises like natural disasters or domestic violence. Connecting back to the idea that unforeseen events can trigger homelessness even for those with prior stability.
And the research provides a truly compelling statistic regarding the cost-effectiveness of prevention compared to reacting after someone becomes homeless.
It does. It states unequivocally, and this is a powerful finding, prevention is 3x more cost-effective than crisis response.
3 times more cost-effective. What does that finding from the research strongly imply for policy and investment priorities? Seems pretty clear.
It implies that from a purely fiscal standpoint, in addition to the obvious human benefits, investing resources into programs that prevent housing loss in the first place is a dramatically more efficient use of funds than waiting for people to become homeless.
Right.
And then having to fund emergency shelters, health care for unsheltered individuals, and efforts to rehouse them. It's a clear economic argument, according to the sources, for prioritizing upstream prevention efforts.
Makes total sense. The research also highlights the housing first model as a proven and effective approach, especially for those with complex needs. How does that work?
Yes, the sources describe the housing first model as an approach where individuals experiencing homelessness are provided with immediate access to independent housing without prerequisites like sobriety or mandatory treatment.
So, no hoops to jump through first.
Essentially, no preconditions for housing. This housing is then paired with voluntary support services designed to help them maintain their housing and address any other issues they may have if they choose to.
Voluntary support.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the success rate mentioned for this model? Does it work?
The research cites a high success rate. 9 out of 10 people placed in housing under the Housing First model remain housed after 1 year.
9 out of 10 people staying housed after a year is incredibly significant for a population often facing complex challenges. And the sources make another striking cost comparison here as well.
They do. They note that providing housing through the Housing First model is estimated to be 3x cheaper than the costs associated with criminalization.
Criminalization.
Meaning the significant public costs incurred when individuals are unsheltered and frequently interact with emergency services, hospitals, police, and the justice system. Housing is cheaper than managing homelessness on the street.
Wow. So the key insight from the research on Housing First is that it flips the traditional script. It isn't about requiring someone to overcome all their challenges before they are deemed ready for housing.
Exactly.
It's about providing stable housing first, recognizing that this stability is the necessary foundation upon which individuals can then choose to address other issues they might be facing, utilizing the voluntary support services available to them.
It prioritizes housing stability as the essential first step and the platform for recovery and addressing underlying issues. It's proven pretty effective according to these sources.
The research mentions a record federal response in 2024 indicating increased government attention and investment. What does the source detail about these efforts?
Well, the sources list several points highlighting increased federal activity and funding. They note that $3.5 billion was allocated to homelessness assistance programs in 2024.
$3.5 billion.
Yeah. HUD launched a Housing and Services Partnership Accelerator aimed at better coordinating those two crucial components, housing and support.
Okay.
There were efforts to streamline the repurposing of federal properties for emergency housing use and a focus on community empowerment through fostering local partnerships to implement solutions.
What does this historic level of investment and activity from the federal government indicate, according to the research? Are things moving in the right direction?
It clearly indicates a significant level of federal commitment and a conscious effort to scale up existing initiatives and explore new, more integrated approaches to addressing homelessness across the country. So, yes, increased focus.
However, and there's usually a however. Immediately following the description of this record response, the research lists current challenges and implementation.
Right. It's not simple.
This is a critical point. The investment and programs are increasing, but obstacles remain in getting help to people. What are these significant challenges the research identifies?
The sources break these down into two main categories: housing market issues and system challenges. Under housing market issues, they cite the pervasive, limited availability of affordable housing units overall. That's a big one.
Resupply problem.
Exactly. They also point to landlord reluctance to accept housing vouchers, often due to stigma, administrative hurdles, or just a preference for market-rate tenants in a tight market.
Yeah, I hear about that.
Another challenge is the competition among various assistance programs for the scarce affordable units that do exist. And a major problem is rising rents consistently outpacing the fair market rent values that determine the value of housing vouchers, making vouchers less effective.
So even if someone gets a voucher, finding a landlord willing to accept it in a market where rents are skyrocketing faster than the voucher value is a huge hurdle, and there simply aren't enough affordable places to go around.
Exactly. It's a tough equation. On the system challenges side, the research points to persistent long waiting lists for housing assistance programs across the country.
Yeah, years sometimes.
Right. There are staffing shortages in the support services programs that are supposed to work alongside housing assistance. Application requirements for various programs can be complex and difficult for vulnerable individuals, especially those experiencing trauma or instability, to navigate.
Bureaucracy hurdles.
And there's often a lack of coordination between different agencies involved in housing, health, mental health, and social services, creating a fragmented system for those needing help.
What do these detailed challenges tell us based on the researcher's perspective? It sounds like money isn't the only issue.
They tell us that while increased funding and political will are absolutely essential and positive developments, they are not sufficient on their own. Systemic and market-based issues create significant friction, delays, and bottlenecks that prevent the effective delivery of help to those who need it most.
So the plumbing is clogged, basically.
In a way, yes. The funding is there. But getting it to translate into stable housing for individuals and families is severely hampered by these underlying structural problems in the housing market and the service delivery system.
The research also briefly mentions some innovative approaches making a difference. It seems like these might be attempts to address some of those stated implementation challenges, like fixing the plumbing.
That appears to be the connection. The sources list examples of approaches designed to overcome these barriers. These include landlord incentive programs, which offer financial bonuses or guaranteed security deposits to encourage landlords to rent to voucher holders.
Okay, sweetening the deal.
Right. Health housing integration, which aims to improve coordination between healthcare providers and housing services. Technology solutions, likely referring to using technology to streamline applications, eligibility, and matching individuals with available resources.
Using tech better.
And robust community partnerships, fostering collaboration between local governments, nonprofits, and other stakeholders. These are highlighted as ways communities are actively working to make the system function better despite the challenges.
And the research also provides a section titled What Communities Can Do, offering actionable steps that local areas can focus on, often tailored to their specific context.
Yes, these are concrete strategies suggested by the research for communities to implement. Number one is to expand housing vouchers. And importantly, it specifically mentioned increasing availability for crisis-prone middle-income earners, directly linking back to our topic.
Tailoring it to this group.
Okay. They also list strengthening tenant protections to reduce preventable evictions through fairer practices, creating emergency funds for a rapid, flexible response to families facing sudden, unexpected crises.
Quick help.
And fundamentally, building affordable housing stock to address the root cause of the supply and demand imbalance driving up costs.
These community-level actions seem like they would effectively complement the federal response and the focus on prevention and proven solutions. They are ways to tackle the problem on the ground.
They offer pathways for local areas to tailor solutions to their specific housing market dynamics, population vulnerabilities, and existing service infrastructure, building upon the broader evidence-based approaches. It's about local action, too.
The research package also includes a section on personal preparedness, offering advice based on the findings, even though the main focus is on structural issues. What does it suggest for individuals?
Right. This section, titled Protecting Yourself and Your Family, outlines steps individuals can consider. Under financial preparedness, it suggests building an emergency fund sufficient to cover 3 to 6 months of essential expenses.
The classic advice.
Yes. It advises understanding your housing rights and tenant protections before a crisis hits. It stresses the importance of knowing about local resources before you desperately need them, so you're not scrambling in a crisis.
Being proactive.
And it reiterates the goal, though challenging for many, of trying to keep housing costs under 30% of your income for financial stability.
Building that emergency fund, which, as we saw, the middle class might rapidly deplete, and trying to keep housing costs low, which is difficult in high-cost areas. But the research presents these as crucial steps for personal resilience. And there's advice on crisis planning specifically.
Yes, the crisis planning points include proactive steps like identifying potential support networks and resources in advance, knowing who you could potentially stay with temporarily, or which local agencies exist.
Thinking ahead.
It recommends understanding your health insurance coverage and potential gaps, tying back to the medical debt trigger, and researching potential eviction prevention programs in your area. The suggestion is also to create a basic financial crisis action plan ahead of time.
What's the implication here? The research spends most of its time on massive systemic issues, but it includes these personal steps. Is it saying it's all on the individual?
Not at all, I don't think. The implication, particularly given the rapid asset depletion and lack of informal networks observed in middle-class cases, seems to be that while systemic change is absolutely fundamental and necessary to create a more just and secure society,
Right.
individual preparedness, to the extent possible, can serve as a crucial personal buffer against the sudden, rapid descent into homelessness when a major shock occurs. It's about maximizing personal resilience within the current system, while still acknowledging that the system itself has significant flaws that need to be fixed through policy.
Okay, so it's both hand, systemic change and personal buffers. Zooming out again to the policy landscape, the research outlines specific policy changes needed at both the federal and state-local levels to address the problem effectively. What's on the federal list?
At the federal level, the research recommends several major policy shifts, establishing a universal housing voucher program to ensure everyone eligible can receive assistance.
That came up earlier.
Yes. Expanded medical debt protections to prevent health care costs from leading to financial ruin and housing loss. Significantly increased federal funding specifically for homelessness prevention programs, and establishing a national affordable housing trust fund to finance the construction and preservation of affordable housing units.
Big structural changes. And what are the recommended policy changes at the state and local levels?
The research recommends strengthening and expanding eviction diversion programs, expanding emergency rental assistance programs to provide rapid help during temporary crises, implementing landlord incentive programs to encourage participation in voucher programs.
Tackling those market issues.
Exactly. And developing coordinated entry systems to streamline how people access housing assistance and related services across different local providers, making the system work better.
It's clear how these policy recommendations align directly with the problems identified and the solutions and prevention strategies that the research highlights as effective. They're essentially proposing implementing what the evidence presented in the sources shows works and targeting the specific triggers identified.
Yes, they are very much evidence-based recommendations directly drawn from the analysis and findings presented throughout this body of research. It follows logically from the problems discussed.
Finally, the research includes a Get Help Now section with resources for anyone currently facing housing instability or homelessness. It's important to acknowledge these are listed in the sources.
Absolutely. The sources list types of resources available, emphasizing that help is accessible. These include national hotlines like 211 for local housing resources, 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, and the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233.
Okay, key numbers.
They also list online resources such as HUD Housing Resources, findtreatment.gov, and endhomelessness.org. And they suggest methods for finding emergency assistance by searching for state emergency rental assistance programs, finding HUD-approved housing counselors, contacting local legal aid organizations, or connecting with 211 for immediate local help.
So, practical ways to find support. And the concluding message from this specific section of the research.
The sources explicitly state, help is available. You are not alone.
That's an important message provided in the research. Wrapping up our deep dive, let's bring together the key takeaways listed in the research and its suggested path forward. What are the main points we should remember?
Okay, the key takeaways listed are, first, middle-class homelessness is a real and growing phenomenon, accounting for a significant portion, 15–25% of new cases.
It's real. Got it.
Second, economic shocks, such as medical crises or job loss combined with high costs, can destabilize anyone, regardless of prior wealth or income. Vulnerability is wider than we think.
Anyone can be affected.
Third, proven solutions exist and are effective, specifically mentioning housing first, prevention programs, and universal vouchers. We know what works.
There are solutions.
And fourth, early intervention through prevention programs is significantly more effective and cost-efficient than reacting after homelessness occurs. Prevention pays off.
Okay, those are clear takeaways. And the path forward suggested by the research, where do we go from here?
The sources propose that the path forward requires us to, first, support evidence-based policies and programs that have been shown to work. Backwoods proven.
Yeah.
Second, advocate for increased funding specifically directed towards homelessness prevention efforts. Invest upstream. Third, build community awareness about the realities of modern homelessness and work to reduce the pervasive stigma associated with it. Talk about it honestly.
Reduce the shame.
And fourth, fundamentally remember and act on the principle that housing is a human right and that homelessness is a solvable problem, not an intractable one. Believe it's possible.
The sources also include take action to data suggestions, such as contacting elected representatives, supporting local organizations working on homelessness, sharing this information to build awareness, and utilizing or sharing the provided resources.
These are the concrete calls to action that the research presents as necessary steps following from its findings and recommended paths forward.
Yeah.
Ways for people to get involved.
Wow. Reflecting on this entire deep dive into this specific body of research, the picture it paints is far more complex and, frankly, more unsettling than the common narrative about homelessness. It's clearly not just a problem at the very bottom of the income scale.
Not at all.
It's presented as a systemic issue driven by specific vulnerabilities and massive external shocks like healthcare costs and housing affordability, which can indeed reach surprisingly high into what we've traditionally considered the secure middle class.
What's fascinating here is how compellingly the research forces us to challenge deeply ingrained stereotypes. It compels us to look at the complex interplay of income, accumulated assets, the absence of certain kinds of informal safety nets, and the sheer force of external economic and health crises. It's complicated.
Bringing this back to you, the listener, based on this research, what does this new understanding about the hitting reality and specific triggers of middle-class homelessness mean for how you think about the issue of homelessness more broadly? Does it change your perception of economic security for yourself or others?
Yeah, does it make you rethink what a safety net truly is? It's more than just money in the bank, it seems.
It really seems that way.
And this research raises an important question for us all to consider. If economic stability, even with prior assets and a solid income, if doing, in traditional terms, everything right, can be so quickly eroded by events like medical debt or housing costs outpacing wages, well, what does that tell us about the fundamental robustness of our current formal social safety nets? our healthcare system, and our housing market.
Yeah, how strong are they really?
It raises an important question. How can we collectively build systems and communities resilient and supportive enough to truly protect everyone from falling through the cracks when faced with the inevitable crises of life? That's something to really mull over.
It absolutely is. Thank you for going on this deep dive with us, exploring this crucial research and its implications. It really does provide a powerful, evidence-based new perspective on a complex and growing problem.
Thank you. It was illuminating to walk through it.
We encourage you to think about the implications this research raises and perhaps explore some of the resources or actions mentioned in the source material if you feel moved to do so. Thanks so much for tuning in and for your support. Every listen, share, and comment helps keep these conversations going.